Picture this. It's 50,000 years ago. The sun just dropped behind the ridgeline, the temperature is falling fast, and somewhere out there in the dark, something with teeth is listening to you breathe. Now, what do? Do you wander off, find a nice quiet spot away from everyone, curl up under a tree, and drift off to sleep completely alone? If you answered yes, congratulations, you just got eaten. Game over. Thanks for playing. Because here's the thing almost nobody thinks about. For the overwhelming majority of human history, sleeping alone wasn't just unusual. It was basically a death wish. And today we're going to dig into why our ancestors piled together every single night like a human dog pile, why that habit stuck around for hundreds of thousands of years, and why, despite all our comfy king-size beds and blackout curtains, a huge chunk of the world still doesn't sleep the way you probably do tonight. Stick around because by the end of this, you're going to look at your own bedroom a little differently. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand why your dog insists on sleeping directly on top of your feet. Turns out that's not weird. That's ancient. Let's start with the blunt, unglamorous truth. Sleep is the single most vulnerable thing a human being does. Think about it. When you're awake, you can run, you can fight, you can at least see the danger coming. But when you're asleep, your muscles go slack, your senses shut down, your brain checks out for hours at a time. You are, biologically speaking, a large, slow, defenseless meat sack lying motionless on the ground. That is a 5-star meal delivered right to the doorstep of every predator in the neighborhood. And early humans knew this. Not because they read a biology textbook, obviously, but because the ones who didn't figure it out got removed from the gene pool pretty quickly. Natural selection is a brutal editor. It doesn't care about your feelings, it just deletes bad ideas, permanently. So if sleeping alone in the open was basically volunteering to be dinner, what was the alternative? Group up, sleep close. Sleep together, because a predator creeping toward a lone sleeping body has decent odds. A predator creeping toward a tight cluster of a dozen humans, some of whom are bound to stir, cough, roll over, or just randomly wake up to pee. Those odds get a lot worse, a lot fast. This is actually a documented survival strategy across the animal kingdom, and it's called the dilution effect, combined with something researchers call many eyes theory. Basically, the more individuals in a group, the lower the statistical chance that any one specific individual gets picked off, and the higher the chance that somebody, somewhere, is alert enough to notice trouble before it's too late. Meerkats do it. Baboons do it. Birds do it when they roost together in huge flocks, and early humans did it in caves, in rock shelters, and huddled around fires in the open savanna. Here's where it gets interesting, though, because it's not just about predators. There's a second monster in this story, and it's one you've definitely met before. The cold. Humans are, frankly, terrible at handling cold on our own. We've got no fur to speak of, comparatively thin skin, and a body that starts losing heat the second the sun goes down. A single human body radiating heat into the open night air is like leaving your front door wide open in January. But pack a dozen bodies together? Now you've built a furnace. Shared body heat, shared airspace, shared warmth. Suddenly that brutal night in the Pleistocene is a whole lot more survivable. Researchers who study early hominins, that's the broader family tree that includes us and our extinct cousins, have found strong evidence that communal sleeping wasn't a lifestyle choice, like picking a Netflix show. It was infrastructure. It was survival technology right up there with fire and stone tools. In fact, some anthropologists argue that group sleeping might be almost as important to human evolution as the discovery of fire itself, because the two go hand in hand. You can't have a fire pit without people gathering around it. And once people are gathering around a fire every single night, guess what happens? They start sleeping around it too. Speaking of fire, let's talk about that for a second, because it changes literally everything. Once early humans mastered fire, roughly somewhere between 1 million and 4. 100,000 years ago, depending on which site you're looking at, the entire nighttime survival strategy flips. Fire does 3 massive things at once. It keeps you warm. It keeps predators away because most animals have a deeply hardwired fear of flame. And this is the underrated one. It extends your usable day. Suddenly, you're not just huddling in silent terror in pitch darkness. You've got light. You've got warmth. You've got a reason to stay up a little later, talking, telling stories, maybe gossiping about that guy in the tribe who keeps stealing extra meat. Sound familiar? It should. That's basically your group chat, minus the phones. And where do people naturally gather around a fire? Close together, shoulder to shoulder, which means the fire didn't just protect the group, it became the literal, physical center of communal sleep. Excavations of ancient hearths repeatedly show sleeping areas radiating outward from a central fire pit, almost like a wagon wheel. Everybody wants to be close enough to the heat, but not so close they roll into the flames in their sleep. It's basically the original floor plan for human housing, and it lasted for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone even dreamed of a hallway. Now, let's zoom out for a second, because there's something even deeper going on here than just safety and warmth. Something psychological. Something that, frankly, still lives inside every single one of us today. Humans are what scientists call an obligately social species. That means we are not just social by preference, the way some people enjoy parties and others don't. We are social by biological necessity. Our brains are wired, from birth, to seek proximity to other humans. Ever notice how a crying baby almost instantly calms down when it's picked up and held? That's not a coincidence. And it's not manipulation on the baby's part. That's hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary programming saying, being alone is dangerous. Being close to others is safety. Infants who wanted contact survived. Infants who were content being left alone in the grass did not pass on their genes. Brutal, but that's how the whole system got built. And this drive to stay physically close doesn't just switch off once you grow up. It follows you your entire life, including straight into your sleeping habits. Sleeping next to another warm, breathing, occasionally snoring human being triggers a release of oxytocin. That's the so-called bonding hormone, the same one that spikes during hugging, during breastfeeding, even during a good laugh with friends. Oxytocin doesn't just make you feel warm and fuzzy, it actually lowers your cortisol, which is your stress hormone. Lower stress hormones mean deeper, more restorative sleep. So in a very real, measurable way, sleeping next to someone else used to make you biologically calmer, safer, and healthier. Sleeping alone did the opposite. It kept your nervous system on high alert because deep down, your ancient brain knew that being alone in the dark meant nobody's got your back. Let's bring in the anthropologists for a second, because we don't just have to guess about all this based on old bones and campfire ash. We actually have living proof, right now, today in the 21st century. There are still hunter-gatherer societies on Earth whose lifestyles give us a rough window into how humans lived for the vast majority of our species' existence. Groups like the Hadza in Tanzania, or the San people of the Kalahari, still practice something researchers call communal sleeping arrangements. Multiple family units, sometimes 10, 15, 20 people, all sleeping in close physical proximity, often within the same shelter or clustered tightly around shared fires. Studies on the Hadza specifically found something wild. Their sleep patterns are staggered. Not everyone falls asleep and wakes up at the same time. There's almost always someone semi-awake or lightly dozing at any given hour of the night. Researchers actually calculated that across an entire 8-hour night there was barely any window, sometimes less than 20 minutes total, where every single person in the group was fully, deeply asleep at once. Think about that for a second. That's not an accident. That's a built-in security system. A rotating, unconscious night watch achieved without a single spoken agreement, without a schedule, without an alarm clock. Just human. Bodies naturally staggering their sleep cycles to keep the group protected. It's almost like your ancestors' bodies were running background software you never even knew existed. And it's not just about predators lurking outside the firelight. Communal sleep also served a wildly practical purpose for raising children, something modern parents, frankly, would probably kill for. It's called alloparenting, and it basically means child rearing wasn't just mom and dad's job. It was the whole group's job. If a baby woke up crying at 3 a.m., it wasn't necessarily the biological parents who had to drag themselves up. Any nearby adult, a grandmother, an aunt, an older cousin could soothe the child. Multiple sets of eyes and ears meant no single person carried the full weight of nighttime vigilance. It was quite literally a village raising a child, mostly because there was no other option. Solo parenting in the Pleistocene wasn't a lifestyle, it was a death sentence, both for the parent, who'd be sleep-deprived and unable to react to danger, and potentially for the kid, too. There's another angle here that doesn't get nearly enough attention, and it's information. Not information like Wi-Fi signals, but information like knowledge, warnings, gossip, the raw social data that keeps a group alive. When a dozen people sleep in the same space, you get constant low-level information exchange, even half asleep. Somebody mutters that they heard something moving near the tree line. Somebody else mentions the rivers rising faster than usual. A kid asks why the stars look different tonight, and an elder mumbles an answer that happens to be completely by accident, a genuinely useful bit of seasonal weather knowledge passed down for generations. None of that happens in isolation. Sleeping apart doesn't just cut you off from warmth and defense, it cuts you off from the nightly download of tribal knowledge that kept everyone one step ahead of disaster. So by now you might be thinking, okay, I get it. Ancient humans slept together because it kept them alive. But here's a question that should be bugging you. If this was such a good system for basically the entire span of human existence, why on earth do most of us now consider it completely normal, maybe even preferable, to sleep totally alone in our own room, in our own bed, with the door shut? Buckle up, because the answer involves castles, farming, the Industrial Revolution, and, I promise this is true, a surprisingly recent invention called privacy. For most of human history, even well past the hunter-gatherer era, into agricultural societies, into medieval Europe, people still slept in groups constantly. Entire families, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, shared a single bed or a single sleeping area, often in a one-room house. And it wasn't just families. In medieval inns, it was completely normal for total strangers to share a bed with each other. You'd show up at an inn, pay for a spot, and get assigned to sleep next to some random traveling merchant you'd never met in your life. No one blinked an eye. Bed space was expensive, heating was expensive, and honestly, the idea that sleeping next to another human was somehow strange or invasive hadn't really occurred to anyone yet. There's even a wonderfully weird historical custom called bundling, practiced in parts of colonial America and Northern Europe, where courting couples would be allowed to share a bed, fully clothed, sometimes even sewn into separate sleeping sacks by cautious parents, as a way to get to know each other overnight without, well, doing anything else. Efficient use of the only warm bed in the house, I suppose. Even royalty didn't escape this. In plenty of medieval and early modern courts, having servants or attendants sleep in the same room as a noble, sometimes even at the foot of the bed, was standard practice. Partly for security, and partly because status back then was measured by how many people surrounded you, not how much empty space you had to yourself. Being truly, physically alone was, in a lot of cultures, associated with poverty, punishment, or outright danger, not luxury. Solitary confinement as a punishment only makes sense as a punishment because isolation genuinely messes with the human brain. We built prisons around the idea that being alone is a form of suffering, long before we built bedrooms around the idea that being alone is a form of comfort. Funny how that flipped. So, what actually changed? Two big things: architecture and ideology. As homes got bigger and started having multiple rooms, a genuinely massive shift that mostly took off during the Renaissance among the wealthy, and then trickled down to everyone else over the following centuries. The physical option to sleep separately finally existed for the first time in a widespread way. Before that, most families literally didn't have enough space to spread out even if they'd wanted to. And then came industrialization, which supercharged this whole shift. Factories needed workers on strict, individual schedules. Cities got crowded, and suddenly personal space became this valuable status symbol. Having your own room, your own bed, became a marker of wealth and respectability. Sleeping alone stopped being a weird impossibility and started being something to aspire to. The Victorians, in particular, went all in on this idea, wrapping it up in ideas about modesty, privacy, and individualism. Doctors and moralists in the 1800s even started writing pamphlets warning that sharing a bed was unhealthy, claiming it spread disease and bad air, and pushing the idea that every family member, even young children, should ideally have their own separate bed and, if possible, their own separate room. A lot of that science was shaky at best, but the cultural message stuck hard. And that's really the core shift, right there. Individualism. Ancient humans thought in terms of the group because the group was the only thing standing between them and death by hyena. But modern industrial and post-industrial societies, especially in the West, shifted the entire cultural mindset toward the individual. Your own space, your own achievements, your own bedroom with a lock on the door. It's a philosophy that's maybe 400 or 500 years old at most, competing against a survival strategy that's been running successfully for a couple 100,000 years. And yet somehow we've convinced ourselves that sleeping alone is the natural, default way to do things, when historically it's actually the weird new experiment. Here's a fun little twist to throw into the mix, because sleep itself used to look completely different too. Historians have found substantial evidence that pre-industrial Europeans didn't even sleep in one solid 8-hour block the way we obsess over today. They practiced something called segmented sleep. First sleep for a few hours after dark. Then a period of an hour or two of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night, where people would chat, pray, have sex, tend the fire, or just lie there thinking, before drifting into a second sleep until morning. And guess what made that whole nighttime routine bearable, safe, and honestly kind of pleasant? Having other people right there with you. Waking up at 2 a.m. in a room by yourself is unsettling. Waking up at 2 a.m. surrounded by the low murmur of family members also stirring, that's just Tuesday. It's worth pointing out, too, that this two-phase sleep pattern didn't disappear because it was flawed. It disappeared largely because of artificial light. Once cheap, reliable lighting showed up, first with better candles and oil lamps, then gas lighting, then electric bulbs, people started staying up later, compressing their nighttime hours, and eventually collapsing that old two-part sleep into the single continuous block we now treat as the only correct way to sleep. So even the very structure of a night's rest has been re-engineered by technology, not biology. Your ancestors' brains and bodies are still somewhat expecting that old rhythm, the fire, the midnight stirring, the murmur of other people nearby. Modern sleep is, in a very real sense, running an ancient piece of hardware on a completely rewritten set of instructions. Now let's swing back to biology for a second, because there's a reason all of this still matters to you. Personally, tonight, even if you're about to go sleep completely by yourself in a locked apartment in a city with 0 leopards. Modern sleep science has actually caught up with what our ancestors intuitively knew all along. Studies on co-sleeping adults, and I mean healthy consenting adult partners here, not the debated topic of infant co-sleeping, that's a whole separate conversation, consistently show that sleeping next to a trusted partner can improve sleep quality, reduce nighttime cortisol spikes, and even help regulate each other's sleep cycles through something researchers call sleep concordance. Couples who sleep together often unconsciously sync up parts of their sleep architecture over time. Your body is, quite literally, still running ancient software that recognizes a warm, breathing presence next to you as a signal that says, you're safe. You can power down more fully. On the flip side, chronic loneliness and sleeping in isolation have been linked in multiple studies to worse sleep quality, higher stress hormone levels, and even weakened immune function. Your nervous system, deep down in some very old, very stubborn part of your brainstem, still isn't fully convinced that a locked door and a smartphone alarm count as adequate protection. It still wants a group. It still wants a fire. It still wants the reassuring sound of somebody else breathing nearby. There's even research on something called first night effect, where people sleeping in an unfamiliar environment show measurably lighter, more vigilant sleep. Almost like one half of the brain stays semi-awake on guard duty while the other half rests. Scientists have found this happens with actual brain activity, one hemisphere showing more alertness than the other during that first unfamiliar night. It's basically your ancient watch shift instinct, still fully operational, kicking in the second your environment feels unpredictable. Hotel rooms, new apartments, campsites, all of it can trigger this leftover survival reflex because your brain hasn't fully accepted that danger doesn't work the way it used to. Isn't that wild? You can have the most secure apartment building in the safest city on Earth, and some ancient circuit in your skull is still quietly, instinctively on guard, because for 200,000 years, alone meant dead. So the next time you're lying awake at 1 a.m. in an empty room, feeling that strange, hard-to-explain unease, you're not imagining things, and you're definitely not broken. You're a hunter-gatherer with Wi-Fi. Your brain hasn't caught up to central heating, deadbolts, and neighborhood watch apps. It's still running on hardware built for sleeping in a huddle of 15 people around a crackling fire, with somebody's cousin snoring 2 feet away, and somebody's grandmother half listening for jackals. And honestly, maybe that explains a lot about why sleepovers feel so oddly comforting even as adults. Why couples instinctively reach for each other in the middle of the night without even waking up. Why kids beg to sleep in their parents' room during thunderstorms. Why soldiers in the field, camping trips with friends, even crowded festival tents somehow produce some of the most memorable, comforting nights of sleep people ever talk about. It's not really about the mattress. It's about the ancient, deeply wired sense that you are not alone in the dark and that somebody, somewhere close by, has got your back until sunrise. It also might explain some very modern, very strange habits we don't usually connect to ancient survival at all. Ever notice how comforting background noise can be at night? A podcast playing quietly, a fan humming, a TV left on low in another room? Some researchers think that's a kind of substitute for the ancient soundscape of communal sleep, the murmur of voices, the crackle of a fire, the rustle of other bodies shifting nearby. Total silence, weirdly, can feel more unsettling to a lot of people than a low, steady hum of something else is out there with me. Your brain doesn't necessarily need another person physically in the room. Sometimes it just needs to be convinced it's not the only living thing awake in the universe. For most of human history, sleeping alone wasn't independence. It wasn't luxury. It was a 5-alarm warning sign that something in your life had gone terribly, dangerously wrong. Community wasn't a nice bonus feature of ancient life. It was the entire operating system. And every single night when the fire burned low and the group settled into that pile of shared warmth and shared breathing, they weren't just resting. They were surviving, together, the exact same way their ancestors had for hundreds of thousands of years before them. So yeah. Next time someone jokes that your dog hogging the bed is just being needy, maybe cut them a little slack. They're not needy. They're doing exactly what humans and their closest animal companions have done since before we even had language. To complain about it. Staying close, staying warm, and staying alive. One shared, watchful, slightly crowded night at a time.